The Starlight Diner was a graveyard for lost souls, but the man bleeding across its checkered floor at 2 a.m. was an emperor. Everyone recognized Kaylan Casano, the ruthless head of the New York syndicate. The room froze in terror. No one dared breathe until a waitress spoke his native tongue. The rain in upstate New York didn't just fall, it punished. It hammered against the greasy plate glass windows of the Starlight Diner, a forgotten relic perched on the edge of Route 9W. Inside, the air smelled of stale filter coffee, burnt hash browns, and the heavy lemon bleach used to scrub the counters. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The graveyard shift. Beatrice Gallagher leaned against the back counter, a damp rag resting in her hands. At 27, Bea had lived 3 different lives, but right now, she was just a waitress trying to make rent for a crumbling apartment in Albany. Her apron was stained with cherry pie filling, and her dark hair was pulled back into a messy, utilitarian knot. The diner was nearly empty. Old man Henderson was snoring softly in booth 3, and a pair of long-haul truckers were nursing lukewarm mugs in the corner. Behind the register, the night manager, a nervous wreck named Gary, was aggressively counting the meager cash drawer. Then, the bell above the door chimed. It wasn't the usual aggressive jingle of a trucker pushing out of the storm. It was a weak, hesitant sound. The heavy glass door swung open, bringing with it a violent gust of freezing wind and the sharp, metallic stench of copper. The man who stumbled inside was large, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit that probably cost more than the diner itself. But the suit was ruined. The left side of the jacket was saturated with a slick, dark wetness that appeared black under the flickering fluorescent lights. He leaned heavily against the aluminum doorframe, his breathing a ragged, wet rattle. Gary looked up from the register. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, translucent white. The handful of singles he was holding fluttered to the floor. Even up here, hours away from the 5 boroughs, people recognized Kaylan Casano. He was the undisputed boss of the Casano crime family, a man who had violently seized control of the East Coast ports after a bloody 3-year war with the Lucchese and Genovese factions. Just last week, the New York Times had run a front-page expose on him, detailing his alleged involvement in the car bombing of a rival underboss in Bensonhurst. He was known as Il Lupo the Wolf. He was a man who commanded empires, ordered executions before his morning espresso, and never, ever showed weakness. Yet here he was, bleeding out on the linoleum of a roadside diner. Kaylan took a step forward. His leather Oxford shoes slipped on his own blood, and he crashed heavily into a red vinyl stool, sending it spinning. The 2 truckers in the corner took one look at his face, stood up in unison, threw a $20 bill on the table, and bolted out the side emergency exit without a word. Old man Henderson didn't wake up. Don't go near him. Bay, Gary hissed, his voice trembling so violently he sounded like he was vibrating. He dropped to his hands and knees, hiding completely behind the counter. I'm calling the cops. No, wait, if I call the cops, his people will kill us. Just stay still. Let him die. Beatrice watched the Mafia boss struggle to his hands and knees. Kaylan's face was ashen, his sharp, aristocratic features contorted in agony. His dark eyes, famous for their cold, deadened stare, were glazed over with shock. He clutched his abdomen, blood spilling through his fingers, pooling rapidly on the floor. Anyone else would have run. Anyone else would have listened to Gary. But Bea had seen blood before. She had seen violence before, intimately and terribly, during a life she had crossed an ocean to escape. Kaylan tried to push himself up, a guttural groan escaping his throat. He looked around the diner, his gaze sweeping over the empty booths, finding no salvation. He was a king, dying in the dirt. Bea tossed her damp rag onto the counter. She walked around the register, ignoring Gary's frantic, whispered pleas. Her worn sneakers squelched softly as she approached the bleeding man. Kaylan's head snapped up as her shadow fell over him. Even dying, his instincts were lethal. His right hand twitched, moving toward the shoulder holster hidden beneath his ruined jacket. Bea didn't flinch. She stopped 2 feet away, dropped to a crouch so she was eye level with him, and spoke. Signore, she said, her voice steady and quiet. Ha bisogno di aiuto. Se resta qui, morirà dissanguato. Sir, you need help. If you stay here, you will bleed to death. Kaylan froze. His hand hovered inches from his weapon. He stared at her, his dark eyes snapping into sharp focus, the dialect catching him completely off guard. She didn't just speak Italian, she spoke with the distinct rolling cadence of a native Neapolitan, the exact dialect of his childhood, of his inner circle. He looked at her faded uniform, her tired eyes, and her cheap plastic name tag that read B. "Chise, who are you?" he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly threat despite the pain. "Nessuno?" Bea replied smoothly. She reached out gently, but firmly pushing his hand away from his gun. "But I am the only one in this room who is going to keep you breathing. Can you walk?" He stared at her for a fraction of a second longer, calculating the risk. Then, he gave a curt, tight nod. "Get him up!" Gary whined from behind the counter. "Get him out of here, B! They're gonna come shoot up the place!" "Shut up, Gary, and go lock the front door." B snapped, her voice suddenly ringing with an authority that made the manager jump. She slipped her arm under Kaylin's heavy shoulder. "On 3, Mr. Cassano. 1, 2, 3. Kaylin grunted, driving his way upward. B staggered under his sheer mass, but she held her ground, locking her knees. Together, they hobbled away from the front windows, leaving a thick, terrifying smear of red across the diner floor. She steered him toward the narrow hallway in the back, past the restrooms, and shoved open the heavy oak door that led to the dry storage room. It was windowless, smelling strongly of flour and canned peaches. "Sit," she commanded, kicking a wooden crate toward him. Kaylin collapsed onto it, his head falling back against a metal shelving unit, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Lock the door," he whispered, coughing. A fleck of blood dotted his pale lips. They are close." B slammed the heavy door shut and threw the deadbolt. She was trapped in a closet with the most dangerous man in New York, and the people who had put a bullet in him were right behind. B wasted no time. She stripped off her cherry-stained apron and tossed it aside. From the top shelf, she yanked down the diner's industrial first aid kit, a dusty metal box that hadn't been opened since a line cook sliced his thumb 3 years ago. "Take the jacket off," she ordered, dropping to her knees in front of him. Kaylin didn't move. His eyes were half closed, his face glistening with a cold sweat. "Can't," he muttered. B didn't ask twice. She reached forward, her hands covered in his blood, and forcefully peeled the heavy, ruined Brioni jacket off his shoulders. He flinched violently, a sharp hiss escaping his teeth, but he let her do it. His white dress shirt was plastered to his skin. She grabbed heavy-duty trauma shears from the kit and cut the shirt open, exposing his torso. The wound was ugly. It was a dark, jagged hole just below his lower left ribcage. It was bubbling sluggishly, which meant it hadn't hit a major artery, but the volume of blood was still critical. "Bullet is still inside," Kaylin ground out, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like the bone might snap. A 38, deflected off the car door. "I am a waitress, not a trauma surgeon," B said, her hands moving quickly as she ripped open thick gauze pads. "I can't take it out. I can only stop the bleeding." "Do it." She pressed a thick stack of gauze directly into the wound and leaned all her weight into it. Kaylin let out a roar, suffocated roar, his hands gripping the edges of the wooden crate so hard the old wood splintered. His massive frame went rigid, muscles locking in sheer agony, but he didn't push her away. He rode the pain, his eyes locking onto hers. For a long moment, the only sound in the storage room was his heavy, ragged breathing and the distant, muffled sound of the rain outside. "Why do you speak Italian?" he asked, his voice strained, trying to focus on something other than the fire in his side. "You look Irish." "Gallagher." "My father was Irish," B said, keeping her pressure even. "My mother was from Napoli. She took me back there when I was a kid. Lived there until I was 22. And now you pour coffee in a shithole on Route 9. His eyes narrowed, analyzing her. Even bleeding out, he was piecing together a puzzle. "What are you running from, Beatrice?" She met his gaze, her expression hardening. "That's none of your business. I'm keeping you alive. That doesn't mean we're friends." A faint, grim smirk touched Kaylin's lips. "No one talks to me like that. Not unless they want to end up in the trunk of a Lincoln. Right now, your Lincoln is probably full of bullet holes, and you're sitting on a crate of expired tomato paste B shot back. So maybe dial back the threats, Mr. Cassano." He chuckled a dry, raspy sound that turned into a wince. Suddenly, a loud, violent crash echoed from the front of the diner. It sounded like the glass door had been kicked open. Kaylin went perfectly still. The air in the tiny storage room instantly turned to ice. He reached down to his right side and unholstered a heavy, matte black Sig Sauer 9mm. He checked the chamber with one hand, his eyes never leaving the wooden door. The Calabrese family, he whispered, his tone devoid of emotion. They had a rat in my detail. Ambushed me on the interstate. They won't leave witnesses, Beatrice. Bea felt a cold spike of adrenaline punch through her chest. If they found them in here, they were both dead. Gary would give them up in a heartbeat. Keep pressure on it, Bea ordered, grabbing his free hand and forcing it onto the blood-soaked gauze. What are you doing? Kaylin demanded, gripping her wrist as she tried to stand. You go out there, they will kill you. If I don't go out there, they'll search the whole place, she whispered fiercely. I have to clean the blood. Stay quiet. She wrenched her wrist free, unlocked the deadbolt as silently as possible, and slipped out into the narrow hallway, easing the door shut behind her. She practically flew to the utility closet, grabbing a mop and the industrial bleach bucket. She sprinted down the hall. In the main dining room, the scene was chaotic. 3 men in dark, rain-soaked trench coats had cornered Gary behind the register. The leader, a tall, gaunt man with a jagged scar running down his cheek. Bea instantly recognized him from late-night true crime broadcasts as Silvio, the Snake, Russo, a known enforcer for the Calabrese syndicate, had a revolver pressed directly against Gary's forehead. I'm going to ask you one more time, you little worm, Silvio sneered. A man came in here, bleeding. Where did he go? I swear, Gary sobbed, his hands raised high in the air. Bea threw the mop bucket down hard. The loud plastic crack echoed through the diner. All 3 men whipped around, guns raised, pointing directly at her chest. Bea didn't freeze. She forced her face into an expression of utter, panicked exhaustion, the perfect picture of an overworked, terrified waitress. Hey, don't shoot, please, she screamed, holding her hands up, the mop still clutched in one. Silvio lowered his gun slightly, eyeing her up and down. Who are you? I'm just the waitress, Bea stammered, letting her voice shake. It wasn't entirely an act. Her heart was threatening to break her ribs. Please, whatever you want, take it. The register is open. Silvio stepped away from Gary and walked slowly toward Bea. He looked at the smear of blood on the linoleum, then down at the mop bucket. We don't want the cash, sweetheart, Silvio said softly, stopping inches from her. He smelled of wet wool, cheap cologne, and gunpowder. We want the guy who spilled all this red paint on your nice clean floor. Bea swallowed hard, looking at the blood. A guy came in here about 10 minutes ago. Huge guy in a suit. He was bleeding everywhere. Scared the absolute hell out of us. And? Silvio prompted, raising his gun so the barrel rested gently under Bea's chin. The cold steel made her breath hitch. Where is he? He grabbed a whole stack of napkins off the counter. Bea cried, pointing toward the side emergency exit where the truckers had fled. He pressed them to his side, and he just kept going. He kicked open the side door and ran out toward the old train tracks behind the diner. He said if we called the cops, he'd kill us. Silvio stared into her eyes, searching for a lie. Bea forced herself to tremble, letting a single tear spill over her eyelashes. She thought of her mother. She thought of the abusive ex she had fled in Palermo. She channeled every ounce of real fear she had ever felt and projected it right at the mobster. Silvio held her gaze for 10 agonizing seconds. Then, he lowered the gun. The tracks. Silvio barked over his shoulder to his men. He's making a break for the rail yard. Move! The men turned and bolted toward the side exit, kicking the door open and rushing out into the torrential rain. Silvio lingered for a moment, tossing a $100 bill onto the bloody floor. Buy yourself something pretty, waitress, and forget you saw us. He turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind him. Bea stood paralyzed for a full minute, listening to the sound of tires screeching as their cars tore out of the parking lot and headed toward the tracks. When she was sure they were gone, she collapsed against the counter, gasping for air. Gary was curled in a fetal position behind the register, sobbing quietly. Bea picked up the mop, mechanically wiping away the bloodstains, pouring pure bleach onto the floor to mask the smell. Once the diner looked completely normal, she walked slowly back down the hallway to the storage room. She unlocked the door. Kaylan Cassano was right where she left him. His gun was still aimed squarely at the door. When he saw it was her, he slowly lowered the weapon. He looked paler, weaker, but the sharp intelligence in his eyes remained completely intact. They bought it, Bea whispered, sliding down the wall to sit on the floor across from him. They're gone, searching the rail yard. Kaylon stared at her, an unreadable expression crossing his harsh features. He had heard the entire exchange through the thin walls. He had heard her lie to Silvio Russo without missing a beat, looking down the barrel of a gun to save a man she didn't even know. You, Kalen said quietly, his voice a low rumble in the tight space, are a very dangerous liar, Beatrice Gallagher. It kept you alive, she shot back, exhausted. Kalan leaned his head back against the metal shelf. He looked at the makeshift bandage, then back at her. The cold, ruthless exterior of Il Lupo seemed to fracture, just for a second. Yes, he said softly. It did, and Kalan Cassano never forgets a debt. From this night forward, your life belongs to me. Bea looked up, her heart skipping a beat at the strange, possessive intensity in his words. She had saved a monster, and now, she realized with a sinking dread, the monster had noticed her. The silence in the dry storage room was heavy, broken only by Kalen's shallow, rattling breath. The makeshift gauze bandage was already soaking through, a terrifying bloom of crimson expanding across the stark white cotton. I need a phone, Kalen rasped, his head rolling slightly against the metal shelving unit. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving nothing but the crushing reality of his injury. Not a cell. They can ping the towers. A landline. Bea wiped a streak of drying blood from her forehead, leaving a faint, rusty smear across her pale skin. Gary ripped the office phone out of the wall last month when the bookies called him too many times. There's only the payphone out front by the restrooms. Help me up. You're not walking out there, Bea said flatly, her voice brooking no argument. She looked at the giant of a man, calculating the odds. Tell me the number. I'll make the call. Kalan's dark eyes locked onto hers. Trust was not a currency he traded in, especially not with strangers. But as another wave of agonizing pain ripped through his side, he realized he had no leverage. He was dying in a room that smelled of canned peaches. Area code 914. He breathed, his voice barely a whisper. 555-0298. A man will answer. Tell him Il Lupo is blind on Route 9W. Tell him to bring the mechanic. Bea repeated the number in her head, committing it to memory. Who is the mechanic? Dr. Arthur Pendleton. Kalen grunted. He doesn't ask questions. Go. Before Silvio realizes the train tracks are empty. Bea slipped out of the storage room. The diner was eerily quiet. Gary locked himself in the manager's office, the faint sound of a filing cabinet being dragged in front of the door echoing through the empty restaurant. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on the glass. She dropped a quarter into the greasy slot of the payphone. Her fingers, still trembling and tacky with Kalen's blood, dialed the number. It rang once. Twice. Yeah, a gravelly, distinctly New York voice answered. I have a message, Bea said, trying to keep her voice steady. Il Lupo is blind on Route 9W, at the Starlight Diner. He needs the mechanic. There was a fraction of a second of dead air. The shift in the man's demeanor on the other end of the line was palpable, even through the crackling connection. Who is this? The voice demanded, cold and sharp. Just the waitress who stopped him from bleeding out, Bea replied. Hurry, he doesn't have much time. She slammed the receiver down before he could trace the call or ask anything else. She hurried back to the storage room, grabbing a few clean bar towels and a bottle of rubbing alcohol from the front counter on her way. For the next 45 minutes, time dilated. Bea sat on the floor opposite Kalan, pressing the clean towels against his wound when the first set soaked through. He drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering in a thick, rapid Neapolitan dialect that made Bea's chest tighten. It sounded too much like the men she had crossed an ocean to escape. Suddenly, the roar of heavy engines cut through the storm. Tires screeched on the wet asphalt outside. Heavy doors slammed shut. Bea peeked through the narrow crack of the storage room door, her heart hammering in her throat. 3 matte black SUVs had surrounded the diner. 6 men in tailored suits and dark raincoats, piled out, weapons drawn and sweeping the perimeter. The front door was kicked open, shattering the lock Gary had just secured. Boss! A voice roared. It was the man from the phone. He was broad, with a broken nose and eyes like chips of flint. Bea stepped out of the hallway, her hands raised. In here! He's in the back! The men swarmed the hallway. The leader, Thomas Reed, Kalen's ruthless underboss, pushed past Bea without a second glance, followed closely by a slight, bespectacled man carrying a massive black trauma bag, Dr. Pendleton. Jesus Christ, Dom, Thomas swore, dropping to his knees beside the Mafia boss. Dr. Pendleton was immediately at work, cutting away the rest of Kalen's ruined shirt, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a combat medic. Blood pressure is dropping. I need to pack this properly and get him in the transport. We have an hour, tops, before he goes into hypovolemic shock. Get him up, Thomas barked to two of the enforcers. They lifted Kaylan. Even half-conscious, the boss gritted his teeth, refusing to scream. As they carried him past Bear, Kaylan suddenly reached out, his bloody hand clamping down on her wrist with surprising, desperate strength. "Ha!" Kaylan rasped, looking at Thomas. "She comes with us." Bea yanked her arm back, her eyes wide with panic. "No! Absolutely not! I did my part. I called you. I kept him alive. I'm staying right here." Thomas looked at Bea, then down at his bleeding boss. He turned back to the waitress, his expression utterly devoid of sympathy. "Silvio Russo is not a stupid man, sweetheart," Thomas said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "He's gonna search that rail yard, find nothing, and realize a waitress with a mop bucket played him for a fool. When he comes back to this diner, and he will come back, he won't be asking questions. He'll just start shooting." Bea felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at the bloody linoleum, then out the window into the pitch-black storm. Thomas was right. She had painted a target on her own back the second she lied to the Calabrese enforcer. "Grab her coat," Thomas ordered one of his men. "We're moving." Bea didn't fight as a heavy leather jacket was draped over her shoulders. She stepped out into the freezing rain, leaving the Starlight Diner behind forever, stepping into the back of a bulletproof SUV that smelled of antiseptic and expensive leather. 2 weeks later, the relentless upstate storm was nothing but a memory, replaced by the crisp, golden sunlight of early autumn. Bea stood on the expansive stone balcony of the Cassano estate, a sprawling, heavily fortified compound hidden deep within the Catskill Mountains. Below her, meticulously landscaped gardens stretched toward a high, electrified perimeter fence patrolled by men carrying automatic rifles. It was beautiful, and it was a gilded prison. Since the terrifying night at the diner, she hadn't been allowed to leave. She was given a luxurious guest suite, a wardrobe of designer clothes that replaced her cheap Albany thrift store finds, and anything she asked for except the passcode to the front gates. "The view is better from the south wing," a deep, raspy voice said from behind her. Bear didn't flinch. She turned to see Kaylan Cassano stepping onto the balcony. He moved a little slower than a man his age should, leaning slightly on an elegant, silver-tipped cane, but the lethal aura surrounding him had fully returned. He wore a dark navy turtleneck and tailored trousers, looking less like a wounded animal and more like the king of a violent empire. "I prefer this view," Bea replied smoothly, leaning her forearms against the stone balustrade. "I can see the guard rotation better from here. They change shifts every 4 hours. You have 30 seconds of blind spots by the east gate." Kaylan paused, a genuine look of surprise flickering across his sharp features before settling into a slow, dangerous smile. He stepped up beside her, the scent of expensive sandalwood and dark espresso washing over her. "You are observant, Beatrice. Most people brought here just admire the roses," he noted, his dark eyes analyzing her. "Dr. Pendleton says I owe you my life. A few more minutes of bleeding on that linoleum, and my heart would have stopped." "I did what anyone would do." "No," Kaylan corrected her, his voice dropping an octave. "Anyone else would have run. You stayed. You stared down Silvio Russo and lied to his face without your pulse skipping a beat. That takes training. Or it takes a life where you've had to lie to monsters just to survive." Bea stiffened. She looked away, focusing on the distant, burning autumn tree line. "I told you, my past is none of your business. When you live under my roof, everything about you is my business," Kaylan said softly. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick, manila folder, tossing it onto the wrought iron patio table between them. "I had Thomas do some digging," Kaylan continued, watching her reaction closely. "You left Naples 5 years ago, but you didn't leave because you wanted a change of scenery. You left because you were running from Declan Hayes." Bea's breath hitched. The name felt like a physical blow to her chest, stealing the oxygen from her lungs. Her hands gripped the stone balustrade so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Declan Hayes, an American expat who had ruthlessly embedded himself in the Sicilian and Neapolitan arms trade. He was charming, wealthy, and a complete sociopath. She had fallen for him when she was 21, blind to the darkness beneath his tailored suits. By the time she realized he was a monster who treated her as a possession to be battered and controlled, she barely escaped Italy with her life, smuggling herself on a cargo ship to New York with nothing but a forged passport. "How did you find that?" Bea whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "I am the head of the Cassano family," Kaylan said simply. "There are no ghosts I cannot unearth. But here is the detail that matters, Beatrice. Declan Hayes didn't stay in Italy. He expanded his operations to the East Coast." Bea's head snapped up, her eyes wide. What? The hit on me at the diner, Kalen explained, his jaw clenching. It was ordered by the Calabrese family, yes. But they bought the weapons, untraceable, military-grade hardware from a new supplier, Declan Hayes. B felt the world tilt dangerously on its axis. The storm, the diner, the bleeding Mafia boss. It wasn't just a random act of violence she got swept up in. The past she had run so hard to escape was circling back, tightening like a noose. He knows you're here, Kaylan said quietly. How? B gasped, panic finally clawing its way up her throat. I changed my name. I lived in a terrible apartment. Because Silvio Russo isn't a stupid man, Kaylan replied. When Silvio realized he was tricked at the rail yard, he went back to the diner. He forced your manager to give up your exact description. When the Calabrese family reported the failure back to their supplier, Declan recognized the description. A half-Irish, half-Neapolitan girl with dark hair who speaks the dialect. He knows it's you, B. Bay squeezed her eyes shut, a tear escaping and tracking down her cheek. 5 years of hiding. All for nothing. Declan was coming for her. Suddenly, she felt a warm, calloused hand gently cup her jaw. She opened her eyes. Kaylan was standing right in front of her. The cold, ruthless exterior of Il Lupo was completely gone, replaced by a fierce, terrifying protectiveness. If he gets his hands on me again, Kaylan, he will tear me apart, B whispered, her voice cracking. Kaylan's eyes darkened, a flash of pure, unadulterated violence swirling in their No one, Kaylan said. His voice, a lethal, vibrating promise, is going to touch you. He supplied the guns that put a bullet in my side, and he put fear into the eyes of the woman who saved my life. He is a dead man walking. He leaned down, his lips mere inches from hers. You walked into the dark for me. Now, I am going to drag your demons into the light and burn them to ash. You are mine to protect now. Before Bayer could process the weight of his words, the heavy glass doors to the balcony burst open. Thomas Reed stood in the doorway, his face pale, an assault rifle gripped tightly in his hands. Boss, Thomas said, his voice tight with alarm. Perimeter alarms just tripped on the south gate. 3 heavily armed strike teams just breached the tree line. It's the Calabrese crew. And they brought an American with them, someone who says he wants his property back. Kaylan didn't flinch. He simply let go of B, his face hardening into an expression of pure, terrifying calm. Il Lupo had awoken. He reached beneath his blazer and drew his Sig Sauer. Take her to the safe room, Kaylan ordered without looking back. He turned his gaze to the tree line, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Let them come. The south wing exploded. The concussive blast rattled the teeth in B's skull, shattering the floor-to-ceiling windows of the master balcony into a million glittering, deadly diamonds. The heavy thud of automatic weapons fire instantly drowned out the serene hum of the mountain wind, tearing through the pristine manicured gardens below. Thomas grabbed Bia's bicep, hauling her violently toward the interior corridors. Move! The safe room is beneath the wine cellar. Go! But Bea dug her heels into the thick Persian rug. The paralyzing terror she had felt 5 years ago, the helpless fear that had kept her chained to Declan Hayes in Palermo was gone. In its place was a cold, sharp clarity. She was done running. He won't come through the south gate, Bea shouted over the deafening roar of a secondary explosion. Declan always uses a diversion. He's coming through the east garden blind spot, the one I told Kaylan about. Thomas hesitated, his tactical mind calculating the odds. Before he could argue, the heavy oak doors of the east corridor splintered inward. 3 men in tactical gear poured in, assault rifles raised. Thomas reacted with terrifying speed, dropping 2 of them with precise shots to the chest, but a third clipped Thomas in the shoulder. The impact sent the heavy-set underboss crashing into a marble console table, his weapons skittering across the polished floor. Then a tall figure stepped effortlessly over the bodies. Declan Hayes hadn't changed. He still wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his blonde hair perfectly styled, a cruel, easy smile playing on his lips as he held a suppressed USP, 45. He looked like a wealthy Wall Street banker, but his eyes were entirely dead. Hello, little bird, Declan crooned, his gaze fixing instantly on B. Did you really think you could pour coffee in upstate New York and I wouldn't find you? You owe me for the shipment you ruined in Naples. B stepped backward, her pulse hammering against her ribs, but she didn't look away. I owe you nothing, Declan. You belong to me, Declan sneered, raising his weapon toward her. You always did. The only thing she belongs to is this family. The voice was a low, lethal rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. Kaylan Casano emerged from the shadows of the grand staircase. He was bleeding. The sudden, violent exertion had torn his stitches, a fresh, dark stain blossoming against his navy turtleneck, but his presence was absolute. Il Lupo held his Sig Sauer steadily in his right hand, a king defending his castle. Declan laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Casano, you look like hell. You really think you can stop me? You're bleeding out over a waitress. She is not a waitress, Kaylan said softly, his dark eyes devoid of any human mercy. She is the woman who saved my life, and you are a dead man trespassing in my home. Declan's smile vanished. He raised his weapon to fire, but Kaylan was faster. Gunfire erupted in the confined hallway. Kaylan moved with a terrifying, practiced grace, completely ignoring the fiery agony in his side. He fired twice, taking out the remaining tactical guard behind Declan. Declan returned fire, a bullet grazing Kaylan's shoulder, forcing the Mafia boss to take cover behind a heavy marble pillar. "You're slow, Casano," Declan taunted, advancing slowly down the hall. "That bullet in your gut is dragging you down. I'll put the next one between your eyes, and then I'm taking Bayo back to Italy in a cage." B saw Declan raising his gun, moving to flank Kaylan's position. Kaylan couldn't see him. The Mafia boss was pinned. She didn't think. She reacted. B lunged toward the dropped weapon of the fallen guard at her feet. She grabbed the heavy Glock, her hand slick with sweat, but her grip was firm. She remembered the mechanics, the weight, the awful reality of violence she had been forced to learn years ago when she first escaped. She stood up and aimed directly at the center of Declan's chest. "Declan!" she screamed. Declan whipped his head around, his eyes widening in sheer shock as he saw the terrified girl he used to beat, holding a loaded weapon steady on him. That split second of arrogant hesitation was all Kaylan needed. Kaylan stepped out from behind the pillar. The concussive crack of his Sig Sauer echoed like thunder through the hall. The bullet struck Declan square in the temple. The impact threw the American arms dealer backward, crashing through a Venetian glass display case and hitting the marble floor hard. He didn't twitch, he didn't breathe, he was gone. The sudden silence in the hallway was deafening, broken only by the distant, fading sound of gunfire outside as Thomas's men mopped up the rest of the Calabrese strike team. B dropped the gun. Her hands were shaking violently now. She stared at Declan's lifeless body, the ghost that had haunted her for 5 long years, finally, permanently exorcised. Kaylan walked slowly toward her, his breathing heavy, his hand pressing firmly against his bleeding side. He ignored the carnage around them. He stopped in front of her, gently taking her trembling hands in his own, smearing a little of his blood onto her skin. "He is gone," Kaylan whispered fiercely, his thumbs tracing her knuckles. "He will never hunt you again." "No one will." B looked up into his dark, intense eyes. The fear was draining away, replaced by a strange, overwhelming sense of belonging. She had run from monsters her whole life, only to find her salvation in the arms of the most dangerous one of all. "You're bleeding again," she murmured, a faint, exhausted smile touching her lips. Kaylan gave a low, rumbling chuckle, pulling her against his uninjured side, wrapping her in the scent of sandalwood and gunpowder. "Then it is a good thing I have my own personal nurse. Welcome home, Beatrice." Beatrice thought saving the most feared man in New York would be the end of her quiet life, but it was merely the beginning of an empire she never asked to rule. Kaylan didn't just repay his debt, he dismantled her demons, and in the ashes of their pasts, they built a fortress. She was no longer just the waitress who spoke Italian. She was the queen of the Casano Syndicate.